Okay, this video is going to focus on phobias, which you need to know for the learning approach. We're going to look at what phobias are, 3 explanations for them, which you need to be able to describe and evaluate. That's the focus of this video. But you also need to make sure that you can describe and evaluate treatments for phobias as well. So what is a phobia? A phobia is a pathological anxiety disorder. It's actually an irrational fear response to something. So the reason we call it an irrational fear is because it's a fear of something that won't harm you. So it's not being afraid of death or a car crash, it's being afraid of a spider, or it's being afraid of a mouse. Okay, just a little bit of information about phobias then. Between 15 to 20% of the population suffer from an anxiety disorder. Phobias themselves are examples of anxiety disorders. They're actually the most common because 13% of the population are expected to suffer from a specific phobia at one time. Now, the idea is here that phobias are worse within childhood. They're expected to decline as you go through adulthood. But don't forget, a phobia itself is called a phobia rather than a fear because a phobia is something that elicits a physiological response. So increased heart rate, sweats, tears. It's much worse than just being afraid of something. Classical conditioning is the most widely accepted explanation for phobias. Classical conditioning itself focuses on the avoidance conditioning model. Now, this is the idea that the phobic stimulus is paired with another stimulus that leads to anxiety. I'm going to give you a really clear example of this on the next slide so that you understand what I'm talking about. But what was a neutral stimulus, so such as a spider, becomes a conditioned stimulus with a conditioned fear response of fear. Now, a really good example of this is Watson and Rayner's Little Albert study. There is a separate video on that entirely. But this idea of what was a neutral stimulus in a white rat, because he wasn't afraid of it, was paired with a loud bang, which he was afraid of. It did elicit a fear response. And over repeated conditioning and repeated pairing, it resulted in Albert transferring that phobia and having a phobia of the white rat to begin with. Now, just having a quick look at this in an equation form, you've got something that is a natural fear. So, for example, if you are attacked, that produces a fear response. It's natural. We're calling it the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response because you haven't learned that. That is a natural physiological response within you. If we then take something separate like a dog at this point, we would call that a neutral stimulus because it elicits no response from you at all, like a chair or just something like that. You're not taught to fear anything with it. However, if they are conditioned together, so if, for example, you are attacked by a dog and that needs to happen a number of times, it will result in the conditioned stimulus of fear. Now, after a conditioning phase, the dog on its own becomes a conditioned stimulus because we're calling it a conditioned stimulus because you've learnt to have a conditioned response of fear to the dog. But the classical conditioning explanation is that this phobia came from the pairing of the attack with the dog, and the attack was the unconditioned stimulus. Again, the idea is here that within the learning approach, operant conditioning is based on the assumption that if behaviours are repeated and rewarded, then you're more likely to repeat them again. Whereas if you repeat a behaviour that has a negative consequence, such as punishment, then you're not going to repeat those behaviours. Classical conditioning is seen as the main response of why we develop phobias. However, the two go hand in hand, and it's widely accepted that operant conditioning is the reason that these phobias are maintained, so the reason that you still have a phobia in 20 years' time. A good explanation for this is this idea of if you have a child that responds to a spider for being very scared, they put their arms up, they start crying, they start screaming, "Mummy." Mummy comes in and then removes the spider. So the child actually is learning there through negative reinforcement that they're getting something taken away that they don't like if they respond in that way, and therefore they learn to continue in that same way. Equally, if you've got somebody who is afraid of something and they start crying, and then a loved one comes over and gives them cuddles and attention and affection, that may be seen as an example of positive reinforcement, and therefore that response is going to be reinforced, so they're more likely to continue with that phobia. So classical conditioning looks at this acquisition of phobias, whereas operant conditioning is a much stronger explanation of why these phobias are maintained. A good piece of research for this is from Maurer at the bottom, who is explaining what I've just said. Social learning theory, finally, is another explanation of how phobias can be acquired from the learning approach. And this is very simply that the phobic behaviour can be learned through observing and imitating others. Now, there's an entirely separate video on social learning theory, but you know that the most important phrase throughout this is this idea of role models. So again, think about the fact that phobias are usually acquired during childhood. If you've got a child who's looking up at their role model, maybe of a sister, and their sister responds every time that they see a spider with fear, and they've got a phobia and they're crying and they're running away, that child will observe that behaviour of the role model. If they've got the cognitive function to be able to retain that information and to recreate that information, then that child is much more likely to copy or imitate that behaviour, and every time they see a spider they will respond in the same way. And it's again, when you've got people who've got a phobia and there is somebody close to them that shares that same phobia, social learning theory is the more accepted explanation of why that child acquired that phobia.